In Psalms chapter 34, you will see of how the psalmist David talks about the goodness of God. He talks about how that God was there with him in his troubled, difficult, challenging time of his life. The background of Psalm chapter 34 leads us to 1 Samuel chapter 21 and 22. In there we see that David was running away from Saul. Saul was up to killing David. He was chasing David with his men because he wanted to see David killed. He was threatened by David. He was insecure by David. In fact, he had tried to kill David several times. And here David was running for his life because King Saul was after him with his men. And it was in this very difficult situation, very troubling time that David was going through, that he wrote the Psalms. In fact, biblical scholars tells us that David was in a cave when he wrote this psalm. And he sung it to those 400 men that were with him on that day. It was in the darkest moment of his life. It was in that dungeon, it was in that cave that he wrote Psalm 34. He talks about the goodness of God. If you and I are going through a similar difficult situation, it could be any kind of a situation that we may be going through right now. Remember this, God's goodness is still there for us. His hand has never left us. His guidance has never left us. We may not feel it. We may not know it. We may not realize it in our life. But the goodness of God is still flowing. How many of us are grateful that we're alive today? We've heard news, we've seen of how people have passed away, how people have died. But yet, we are still here today. We are grateful to God that we are alive. And I know the reason why we are alive is so that we can bring praise, we can bring honor to God Almighty. The goodness of God surrounds His people. The goodness of God surrounds your life and my life today. So when David wrote this psalm, he was in the darkest moment of his life. He was in the cave when he was pondering upon these very words, these very thoughts that God's goodness was upon his life. You see, David sees God from a very different perspective. Despite of this very troubling time he was going through, David sees God from a very different perspective. How about you and me today? How do we see God? Well, our seeing God will not change the character of God. Our seeing God will not change the personality of God. How we see God does not matter to God. God will always remain God. He will always remain good to us. If you see Him as a God who is a God who have left you, well, God has never left you. If you see God as a God who does not provide for you, well, God has never stopped providing for you. It's just a matter of how you see Him. Well, our seeing God does not and will not change God in any way. God will always remain the same. He's an unchanging God. He will always be a God who will be there for us in times of good and also in times of bad. That's the God that we serve, my friends. But what seeing will do, what understanding God will do, what our vision about God will do is it will change us. It will make us into a kind of a person as to how we see God. If you see God as a God who does not provide for you, you begin to think in that line that God does not provide for you. It only affects you at how you see God. It will never affect God. So our seeing God has to be from His perspective. You see, the significance of seeing, my friends, is very important. We need to understand this, that seeing, as many people say, is believing. Seeing has so much significance. Seeing has so much importance in our life because when we see, we believe. When we see, we know it's true. Seeing silences our enemies. If you look with me at Acts chapter 4 verse 14, this is what it says. And seeing that the man who had been made well was there with them, they were not able to say anything against it. The enemies of the faith, after having seen this man who was healed, they could not say anything. They could not say anything. Why? They could not accuse the healer of Peter and John. They can accuse them. Why? Because they saw this man healed from his sickness. When they see this, they were silenced. Seeing can make a man silent. Now, seeing alters our belief to God. Seeing altars our belief to God. John chapter 2 verse 23 says this, "Now while he was in Jerusalem at the feast of the Passover, a great number of people came to have faith in his name after seeing the signs which he did." People followed Jesus mostly because they saw what Jesus have done for them. Jesus have healed the people. Jesus have done great signs and miracles. And that's why the people believe Jesus. Seeing can cause us to believe in Him. Seeing can cause even our enemies to be silenced. So seeing is important. Seeing has a great significance, my friends. How do you see God? If I may repeat this again, will not change God's character. How we see God will not change God's personality. It will only change us. It will only have impact upon us, upon how we see God. I want us to bear with me as we look at Psalms chapter 34 and see as to how David saw God in that very difficult time of his life. How did he see God? He could have seen God as a God who cannot control the situation. He could have seen God as a God who does not even care about David as he was running from place to place. And it was in this very, event that David acted like a madman in front of the Philistinian king, Achish, who was the king of Gath at the moment. When David somehow landed in this place, and the people recognized David as the great warrior, the one who had killed Goliath. In fact, he was having the very sword of Goliath in his hand when the priest Abimelech had given the sword to him, because David had carried nothing with him. And they recognized that David was the one who had killed Goliath. And the servants of King Achish, the king of Gath, told David and said to him, "Aren't you the man who was hailed as the one who killed thousands of the Palestinians? Aren't you the one who chased away thousands and killed thousands of them? Compared to your King Saul." David realized that he was recognized by the people of Palestine. His life was in danger. He was running from King Saul, was helped by the priest Abimelech, and now he landed in Palestine, in Gath, and his life was under threat, and he had no other way but to act like a madman. And the Bible says that David pretended to be like a madman, and he was dripping saliva from his mouth, and he was acting and pretending as if he was mad. And somehow, King Achish, king of Gath, realized that this man was mad. And he asked his servants, "Why is it that this man has to be brought before me? He seems to be like a mad." And they let him go. And David ran away from that place, escaped his own life, ended up in a cave and wrote the Psalms. How is it that we look at God, my friends? What is our perspective about God? Are you going through a challenging time? What is your perspective towards Him? What is my perspective towards God? Psalm chapter 34, verse 4 to 7. Verse 4 to 7. We will read this together. "I sought the Lord and He heard me and delivered me from all of my fears. They looked to Him and were radiant, and their faces were not ashamed. This poor man cried out, and the Lord heard him and saved him out of all of his troubles. The angel of the Lord encamps all around those who fear Him and delivers them." This is how the psalmist David looked at God. When he was in this very cave writing this psalm, singing this psalm, pondering upon these very words that came into his mind, he looked at God as a protector. He looked at God as a protector. He sees God as a protector of his life. Even though he was running from his enemies, King Saul was after him, he realized that God was his protector. Do you see God as your protector? Do you see that God has protected you from all of the harms that comes along your way? The sickness, the pain, the agony that passed through your way. God had protected you from all of that. Now what we see here is the courage that David had. The courage to sing to God and say, God, despite of this challenging situation, that I'm running away from my enemies, you are still my protector. David was not safe at the moment. King Saul was still after him. In fact, King Saul had reached a point where he met the priest Abimelech. And then when he met him, he knew that Abimelech had protected David. He knew that Abimelech had helped David to escape. And he knew that Abimelech had handed over the sword of Goliath to David. He knew that it was Abimelech who had paved the way for David to escape. And now, Abimelech's life is in danger. And ultimately, Abimelech was killed by King Saul. Just because he wanted to reach to David and kill him. David's life was under threat. Yet it was in that cave that David sang to God and tells him of how that he is his protector. In verse 9 to 10, this is what it says. Oh, fear the Lord, you all his saints. There is no want to those who fear him. The young lions lack and suffer hunger, but those who seek the Lord shall not lack any good thing. And how is David seeing God? He sees God as a God who provides. He calls God as a provider. He says, God, you are my provider. I see and I look at you as a God who provides for all of my needs. I have been running from pillar to post. I have been running away from my enemies. My enemies are against me. They are coming to kill me. Yet there's not a single day, Lord, that I have not gained strength from the food I get, from the support I receive, from the people I met on my way. I have seen of how you provided for me, God. I have seen of how you met my every needs. I've seen, God, you are my provider. You have provided for me. Is it not true that God has provided for you and for me in our own lives? Is it not true that God have showered that blessings of provision in our own lives? I believe you're sitting here today and we're listening to this today. It's because God have provided. God have sustained us. His providence is still there for His people.